Now, it may come as a surprise to you to know that the war for American independence did not necessarily start out as a war for independence. At the outset, the colonists saw themselves as defending their rights as Englishmen. They had done it in the Stamp Act crisis. They had done it in the other crises that characterized the late 1760s and into the early 1770s. And they felt that they were defending their rights as Englishmen when they opposed the British Army that attempted to take supplies and ammunition from from the armory at Concord, Massachusetts. But as time went on, the colonists, at least those who are politically, aware and active and on the side of the revolutionary cause, began increasingly to think in terms of independence. That that's the way things are trending, and so the influencing factors involved with this include bloodshed. Just the mere fact of fighting between colonists and the British Army intensified the alienation between the revolutionary colonists and then the British government. Then you have the existence of what by extension of the word would be called a national government in the form of the Second Continental Congress, and then you have the establishment of a continental army, and so this looks like you know, the beginnings of um, one's own country. You wouldn't quite call it an independent country, but it's a country. It's not a collection of colonies, anymore. And they're governing themselves, and they're making their own decisions, and they're prosecuting, um, their own war effort. Then you have the failure of what's called the Olive Branch petition. There were members of the Second Continental Congress who were opposed to independence. They felt that that things had just gone awry with the British monarch, that his ministers had been giving him bad advice, that that there had that the British Army had made a mistake in going after the colonists, and that that things could be restored. And there were a lot of members of the Second Continental Congress who just thought, this is crazy. This is not going to happen. But let's put together a petition, send it off to King George III, watch things go kablooey, and then these guys who are opposed to independence will realize that there's no way out of this. So it's called the Olive Branch Petition. An olive branch is extending an olive branch. It's sort of an olive branch symbolizes peace, and it got to King George III, and he came right back with what was called a Declaration of Rebellion, which was, I reject your olive branch. You're in full rebellion. You're a bunch of traitors. You know, um, you've messed with the wrong monarch, and so on. So the olive branch petition fails, and with it, the prospect of rejoining the British Empire in some kind of fashion, now seems really pretty unrealistic. Then you have a military success in the form of the evacuation of Boston in March 1776. Up until this time, the fighting has been concentrated at Boston and on the heights around Boston. And what has happened is that the colonists have succeeded in besieging Boston Harbor, and they've gotten cannon and they placed it on the heights above Boston, and now they command the harbor, and it's untenable for the British Army and the British fleet to remain in Boston. And so in March 1776, they evacuate Boston. And so briefly, um, the all 13 colonies, are free of any British forces at all. Of course, for all practical purposes, we're just dealing with Massachusetts, but there are no British forces in the colonies. And so, and the British evacuated for good military reasons, and they knew they were going to come right back, and they had a pretty good idea of where they were going to come back. And actually, continental or revolutionaries who had any military sense knew where they were going to come back, namely, New York City was what they were going to where they were going to come back. But in the meantime, this looked like the revolutionary resistance, to the British crown was succeeding. And then you get the publication of Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense. This happens in January 1776. And you know, Paine is an interesting figure. Um, he was an English radical who had only recently immigrated to the colonies. He'd arrived in 1774. This pamphlet was just 48 pages long, um, and it called forthrightly for complete independence and attacked not only George III, as a tyrant, but also the very idea of monarchy itself. And this was important because, you know, what was the common belief and a well-founded belief in these days is that the most stable form of government was a monarchy. I did the analogy with the Walking Dead at the beginning of this course, and in The Walking Dead, what happens over and over again is people discover that that sort of making decisions by consensus and so forth doesn't work, and so you need to have a single leader. And this was the experience that most of humanity had had. Thomas Hobbes, in his political theory, basically said, "Hey, look, the only way that we have a chance at security is to give our power to a monarch, and once we've done it, we can't take it back, because that's going to be disastrous." And the alternative, was a republic. And you and I might think, "Wow, a republic, that sounds like a really great form of government." No, historically, republics fail. The Roman Republic had failed. A republic that was established in Venice and another one in Florence had also failed. If you looked around for examples of republics everywhere, they collapsed sooner rather than later. If you look at the number of nations in the world today that call themselves republics and maybe even started out as republics in the true democratic sense, they have fallen into authoritarianism. Republican government historically doesn't work. And so people who were inclined toward independence, one of the things that was sort of holding them back was a sense of, well, if we go for independence, we are abandoning monarchy. We are abandoning the most stable form of government. And what Paine does in Common Sense is about half of the pamphlet is just it's just a demolition of the idea of monarchy. You know, Essentially he says, "Hey, look, what monarchy is supposed to do is it's supposed to protect the rights of its subjects." Well, here's example after example after example of how that hasn't happened. Monarchy is supposed to be ordained by God. Look at how Yahweh felt about the Israelites wanting to have a king, King Saul, and so forth. He didn't like it. He didn't like kings. The idea of kings, it's right in the Bible. Um, Monarchies are stable. Look at the English Civil War. Look at these rebellions, that rebellions, this thing, dogs and cats living together. Monarchy has failed, a whole bunch of times. And so, so don't be afraid of losing a monarchy. You're not losing anything. And so, monarchy's corrupt. And the other thing about what Thomas Paine says is that it's really eloquent. One of the things that's in it, that's I think a great statement is a government of our own is our natural right. O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only tyranny in the abstract, but the tyrant in the specific, stand forth. And if you read Common Sense today, and it doesn't take much time, it's only 47 pages. Um, you might find it sort of not that interesting or not that it's not necessarily an easy read because we're in the 21st century. We're used to 21st century prose. This is 18th century prose, and it seems a little obscure to us. But in the 1770s, when people got a hold of this thing, as far as they were concerned, Thomas Paine was speaking plainly and eloquently, and anybody could understand what he was driving at. And practically everyone in the colonies, between January and June of 1776, either read common sense itself or had it explained to them or discussed. So you can imagine people in a tavern and somebody gets common sense and reads parts of it, if not the whole thing. People actually did that kind of stuff. And then you would have, you had conversations about it. About 150,000 copies were sold in that critical period between January and June. If a comparable portion of today's population purchased any such work, the sales would be around 10 million copies. So, this pamphlet, Thomas Paine and his pamphlet Common Sense, is very important to the emergence of sentiment in favor of independence. It really sets the stage for an acceptance of independence. And then in June of 1776, the Virginia legislature, called the House of Burgesses, passes a resolution that goes to its delegate to the Continental Congress and authorizes that delegate, Richard Henry Lee was his name, to put this resolution in front of the Second Continental Congress, for debate and a vote. And it's this resolution: resolved that these United States of America are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. Now, the idea underlying this, the political theory underlying this, comes from more than one source, but an important one are the ideas of John Locke, who was a near contemporary of Thomas Hobbes. And you might recall that Thomas Hobbes believed that man in a state of nature, it was a war of all against all. And it was really bad. And the only way to survive was to give your own individual power, to a central leader, a king, a monarch. And once you gave him that power, it was dangerous to try to take it back. It'd be a disaster to try to take it back. So Thomas Hobbes's idea is, once you give that power away, it's permanent. John Locke's idea is, you give that power away, but it's provisional. That you start out not in a situation of war against all, but you start out in a pretty good situation. So you as an individual and in a state of nature, life's pretty good for you. And so you give power, to a monarch as a kind of a social contract. And the contract is, okay, we will give you our power on condition that you observe our rights, and you protect us, and you help us to create a better civilization and a society that has law and order. That's your end of the contract. So it's a social contract and it involves rights and responsibilities and obligations. And, if the monarch breaks the contract, this justifies the modification or dissolution of the contract, the same way that, in a business situation, somebody breaks a contract, that's it. The contract just isn't in operation anymore. So this is what's going on in sort of the ferment of the way in which independence is being thought about, politically. Now, what I want to show you now is a clip from a documentary about Benjamin Franklin that talks about the Declaration of Independence that follows in the wake of this Virginia resolution calling for independence.
On June 21st, 1776, a packet arrived at Franklin's Market Street home. It was from Thomas Jefferson, who, with Franklin, John Adams, and 2 other delegates, had been assigned to draft a Declaration of Independence. Working in a rented second-floor room of a house a few blocks from Franklin's, and attended by his enslaved servant Robert Hemings, Jefferson completed a first draft. He asked Franklin to suggest such alterations as your more enlarged view of the subject will dictate, The old editor and writer recognized the elegance of Jefferson's prose and made only a few changes before returning it.
Franklin sits back and ponders it a little, and he makes a few really extraordinary suggestions to Jefferson. And one of them is world class. Jefferson had written, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And Franklin said, no. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Just as 2 + 2 is 4 and the sun rises in the morning, it is self-evident that we have a right to revolution.
Franklin is saying we're trying to create a new type of nation in which our rights come from rationality and the consent of the governed, not the dictates or dogma of a religion.
They were doing something very radical and very scary. To say something is self-evident, to say that it's common sense, is to say that there's no other way to think about this. That only an irrational person who's not using their mind correctly could contend with this thing, which is in fact really contentious. It's a classic lawyer's trick to say, we all agree to this thing. Who is we? The we is presumptuous.
They were not talking about liberating women in any particular way, or certainly not slaves, but in incremental ways. It grew and grew, because if you talk about liberty for the individual, of you and me, you're talking about a greater liberty that can be applied to other people.
On July 2nd, the Continental Congress unanimously approved the central clause of the Declaration, proclaiming American independence. 2 days later, July 4th, 1776, 12 of the 13 former colonies approved the entire declaration. New York would take a few more days to make up its mind.
And for the support of this declaration, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
Hi, this is Ken Burns. I hope you enjoyed that excerpt from the film David Schmidt and I made exploring the extraordinary life of Benjamin Franklin. Here are some more clips you might like, and you can watch the entire Benjamin Franklin series on the PBS Video app or at pbs.org.
Hang on, we'll move on. Okay. Yeah, I felt like I needed to, let Ken Burns have his plug because, he's allowing me to use this video clip, in a PowerPoint presentation. It just seems fair is fair. Okay. To recap, the resolution is adopted July 2nd, 1776. It's that's the Virginia resolution. Then there is this idea that, hey, we need to have a declaration explaining why we seek independence. And one of the reasons for this is that John Locke talks about how there are conditions under which, a monarch becomes a tyrant and the social contract is broken, and the subjects have the right to alter or abolish the social contract that exists. But a great deal of political thought said basically you can't do this for some casual reason. It has to be major. It has to be tyranny. And so the Declaration of Independence was designed to show that that independence, changing this form of government, altering or abolishing it, was the result of major tyranny. And so that's what the Declaration of Independence was designed to do. And this is a famous painting done in the 19th century of the Declaration of Independence. And I can tell you right now, this never happened. The committee that drew up the Declaration of Independence, you can see Benjamin Franklin there, you can see Thomas Jefferson there, John Adams is there, and a couple other guys are there. They weren't there. The delegates weren't all there. The Declaration of Independence was signed over a period of months. So it took a long time for the 55 signatures to all get there. So this is a kind of a romantic view of it. let's take a look at the document itself. And I don't want to read this thing word for word, but what I want you to notice is, the very beginning of it, the preamble. And this is the part that everybody remembers. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So, this is a big deal. We understand that it's a big deal, and we're going to explain to you in a way that you will understand and agree with why it's a big deal. And he starts off, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. This is the lawyer's trick that just talked about in the previous clip. That they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And by the way, happiness is kind of a funny word to use in this context. What they really mean is the pursuit of property. If you want to have wealth and security and so forth, it comes in the form of property. You have enough wealth and enough property, I guess you'll be happy in the bargain. But the rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness or property. That's what the monarch is supposed to supply. That's where governments come from. And the governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And this is a John Locke idea. And then that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. This is Jefferson's prose. It's got a little tinkering from Benjamin Franklin and very little from the others. And it lives, it breathes. Even today when you read it, I think most of us would have a kind of an emotional response to it. I'm obviously having an emotional response to it just reading it to you. It goes on. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. Okay. So, this again, hey, we're not doing this for some small reason. But then, the next passage is that, there's a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object, and this is a design to reduce them, this is, the people, under absolute despotism. That basically what the tyrant, what King George III is trying to do is nothing less than to enslave us. And remember, these 13 colonies. Slavery is legal in all 13 at this point, so everybody knows what an enslaved person looks like, and it ain't so good. So slavery is something that for them is vivid and concrete and real, and they feel that they believe that King George and his ministers are trying to enslave them politically in the same way that that some of them, many of them in the South, have enslaved Africans and African Americans. So, you go on down there, the history of the present king of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And I will let you see the facts that are submitted to a candid world when you read the Declaration of Independence. It's in this module. I want you to read the whole thing, because the facts that are submitted to a candid world is just one complaint after another. And this is where the input of the other delegates to the Continental Congress becomes important, because during the days when the Declaration is debated and discussed, there are certain complaints that are put into the Declaration. There are certain complaints that are pulled out of it. There are complaints that are modified, some of them in a kind of a lawyer-like way. And that part of the Declaration of Independence, is just, it's not eloquent, but the beginnings of it, this claim to, inalienable rights, and that all men, and really the extension would be all people, are created equal. You know, this is important. This survives. When a few years later there was a revolution in France, the revolutionary forces produced something called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and it draws on the ideas that are in the Declaration of Independence. Now, before I end this part of the lecture, I want to point out who's excluded from this. It really is all men are created equal. Women in those days couldn't own property. They certainly couldn't vote. They couldn't vote until the early 20th century. Most people who were African or African American living in what are now the United States were enslaved. The rest were marginalized. They did not have equal rights by any means. They didn't have equality in a meaningful sense. And now we look back and we think, well, this is kind of a hypocritical document, and the founders were hypocritical. Many of them owned slaves and so forth. And then some people are like, oh my God, we can't acknowledge that Washington owned slaves and Jefferson owned slaves and so forth. And they start clutching their pearls over this. But that was the fact of the matter. That's what they did. And so, but that doesn't mean that that our history is like dark, or anything like that. The history of the United States really is a history overall of making the ideals of the Declaration of Independence real. And by and large, what the course of American history shows is the expansion of rights to a greater and greater proportion of the population of the United States of America. It is taking this ideal and making it real.